At 7:18 on Veterans Day, my husband's younger sister stood beneath a 40-foot American flag, held up my Air Force dress jacket, and told 300 people that I had stolen her dead brother's military honors. Cynthia did not shout. She never needed to. She spoke in the patient, sorrowful voice she used when she wanted cruelty to look like concern. My brother earned these decorations, she said, touching the ribbon rack with 2 fingers. Judith has been confused since Thomas died. We have tried to protect her dignity, but we cannot allow his legacy to be rewritten. The mayor sat at the front table. A retired major general was 2 seats away from him. Members of the County Veterans Council faced the stage beneath television lights, and a reporter from the Dayton paper had already raised her phone. Every person who could turn Cynthia's accusation into public history was in that banquet hall. My place card had been moved from the Hale family table to a chair beside the kitchen doors. The printed program identified me only as Colonel Thomas Hale's widow. At my feet rested a battered green flight logbook with 30 years of wear along its spine. On my lap was a leather folder containing certified retirement orders, aeronautical ratings, an air medal citation, and the deed to the land beneath the Veterans Center Cynthia planned to give away that night. I could have stood and interrupted her. I could have demanded my uniform back. Instead, I looked at the clock above the ballroom exit. At 8:03, the memorial video would begin. Cynthia believed she had approved every second of it. She had not. My husband had recorded one final interview 11 days before he died. Cynthia had cut that interview into a 4-minute tribute about his flying career, his leadership, and the center that carried our name. She had removed every sentence in which he mentioned my service, my ownership of the property, or the promise we had made to keep the center out of commercial hands. The county military archive still had the unedited master. So did Cynthia's daughter. I folded my hands over the leather folder and let my sister-in-law continue. She had spent 18 months telling donors that grief had damaged my memory. She had told board members I was pretending to remember missions I had only heard Thomas describe. She had taken my uniform from my home, called it foundation property, and built an entire development deal on the assumption that an aging widow would be too embarrassed to challenge her in public. Cynthia thought my silence meant I had no answer. What she did not understand was that silence had been part of my profession long before it became part of my marriage. I had learned to work while engines screamed, while wounded men begged for their mothers, and while young airmen watched my face to decide whether they should panic. A flight nurse who lost control of her voice could lose control of an aircraft cabin. I was 68 years old that night. I had been underestimated by men with more rank, doctors with less experience, and administrators who thought a calm woman must be a compliant one. Cynthia was not the first person to mistake restraint for surrender. She was simply the first person in my family to do it under a spotlight. 45 years earlier, Cynthia Hale had been a thin 12-year-old with uneven braids and a habit of waiting on the porch whenever her brother came home. Thomas was 10 years older than she was. In her mind, he had never been an ordinary brother. He was the boy who fixed her bicycle, frightened off a schoolyard bully, and left their small Ohio town wearing an Air Force uniform. I met him at Little Rock Air Force Base in Arkansas in 1981. I was a newly commissioned second lieutenant in the Air Force Nurse Corps, still learning how quickly confidence could vanish when a senior nurse asked a question I had not prepared to answer. Thomas was a first lieutenant, completing C-130 qualification training, tall, serious, and so polite that I initially mistook him for dull. Our first conversation happened over a coffee machine that had stopped working. He studied the blinking red light as though it were an instrument panel. "You fly airplanes," I said. "Surely you can defeat a coffee maker." "I fly airplanes because the checklists are better." I opened the water reservoir, removed the paper filter someone had folded in half, and pushed the switch. Thomas watched the coffee begin to drip. "Would you consider joining my maintenance crew?" I outranked the coffee maker. "Not you. Not yet." He smiled when he said it, and that was the beginning. We married 2 years later at a brick Methodist church outside Xenia, Ohio. Cynthia was 14 and furious that the pale blue bridesmaid dress made her look, in her words, like a lampshade. The morning of the wedding, she sat on the fellowship hall floor while I repaired the hem with a hotel sewing kit. "You are taking him away again," she said. I looked up. He was already in the Air Force before he met me. That is different. How? The Air Force is not a person. At 14, she could not explain the rest. I thought she was afraid of losing her brother. I put my hand over hers and promised that marriage would not erase her place in his life. I kept that promise longer than she remembered. Thomas and I spent most of our marriage moving. Illinois, Arkansas, Germany, Texas, North Carolina, back to Germany, then Ohio again. He flew tactical airlift. I trained as a flight nurse and joined aeromedical evacuation crews that moved injured and critically ill patients between forward locations and larger hospitals. People who have never seen an aeromedical cabin sometimes imagine a hospital room with wings. It was not. It was noise, vibration, straps, narrow aisles, changing cabin pressure, limited equipment, and decisions that could not wait for the ground. A patient who looked stable before takeoff could deteriorate over black water with nowhere to land. We learned to secure every line, anticipate every complication, and carry calm into a place designed to shake it loose. During the Gulf War, I flew evacuation missions aboard C-141 aircraft, moving casualties from the theater to hospitals in Europe. Years later, I supported missions connected to the Balkans and then Afghanistan. I did not kick down doors. I did not call myself a combat warrior. I was a commissioned officer and a flight nurse whose duty placed me in operational airspace with wounded people, depending on my judgment. The distinction mattered to me because truth becomes weaker when it is inflated. Thomas understood that. He never described my service as an extension of his own. At home, however, the easier story usually won. When we visited Ohio, neighbors asked Thomas where he had flown and what aircraft he commanded. They asked me whether military life was difficult for a wife. I served too, I would say. Most apologized. Some looked confused. Cynthia usually laughed and smoothed the moment over. Judy is the medical one, she would explain. Tom is the flyer. The first few times, I corrected her. I am also aircrew. Yes, of course, she would say. You know what I mean. I did know. She meant that one uniform in the marriage was real history, and the other was supporting detail. For many years, I treated that habit as harmless. Families create shorthand. Thomas was the pilot. I was the nurse. Cynthia was the little sister who adored him. We all occupied the assigned places, and life moved too quickly for me to argue over every introduction. But shorthand can become a cage when one person controls the words. Cynthia came to live with us for 6 months when she was 19. She had left community college, broken off an engagement, and told her parents she needed space. We were stationed in Little Rock then. Thomas was gone more than he was home, so it was mostly Cynthia and me in a 2-bedroom apartment with bad plumbing and an air conditioner that rattled all night. I helped her enroll in business courses. I drove her to a part-time job at a hotel because she had no car. When she cried over the man she had nearly married, I sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning and listened without telling Thomas things she had asked me to keep private. One afternoon, she found my flight nurse textbook spread across the couch. I thought nurses already knew how to be nurses, she said. Ground medicine and medicine at altitude are not the same. She picked up a manual, saw the diagrams, and put it back down. Tom says the pilots are responsible for everyone on the aircraft. They are responsible for flying it. I am responsible for the patients. She smiled in a way I did not recognize then. He would never see it that narrowly. It was a small sentence, but it revealed something I should have understood much earlier. Cynthia did not merely love her brother. She needed him to be the central explanation for everything around him. Anyone who possessed a separate competence near Thomas threatened the story she preferred. Still, there were good years between us. She married a decent man named Paul Vale, raised a daughter, Megan, and built a successful event planning business in Cincinnati. We spent Christmases together when assignments allowed. I held Megan at her baptism. Cynthia sat with me in a hospital waiting room when my father had bypass surgery. When Paul lost his job, Thomas and I quietly covered 3 mortgage payments. She repaid every dollar. That history mattered because betrayal is rarely committed by a stranger. A stranger can injure you. Only someone who has eaten at your table knows where the soft places are. Thomas and I never had children. We tried. There were tests, procedures, 2 miscarriages, and 1 specialist who delivered bad news while staring at a computer screen. For a while, every birth announcement felt like proof that the world was continuing without us. Megan became precious to both of us, though we were careful not to treat her like a substitute daughter. She spent summers at our house, followed Thomas around hangars during family days, and asked me to teach her how to take a pulse. When she was 9, she drew a picture of the 3 of us in uniforms. Thomas had pilot wings the size of birds. I had a red cross on my chest. Cynthia had told her that was what nurses wore. I laughed and placed the drawing on the refrigerator. I did not understand that children inherit the proportions adults give them. I retired from active duty in 2005 as a lieutenant colonel after 24 years. My final assignment was in aeromedical training. Thomas retired the following year as a colonel. At his ceremony, the commander spoke about command hours, difficult deployments, and the younger pilots Thomas had mentored. At mine, an old chief nurse described a night flight from Europe when a patient's airway failed and our crew kept him alive until landing. Cynthia attended Thomas's ceremony with flowers, a photographer, and a restaurant reservation for 20 people. She missed mine because a corporate client changed the date of a conference. She sent a card that said, "Congratulations on being free to enjoy Tom's retirement." I placed it in a drawer and told myself she had meant well. Retirement brought us back to Greene County, where my mother had left me Maple Run Farm. The property sat 30 minutes from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, beyond a line of sycamores and a narrow creek that flooded every spring. The farmhouse needed a roof. The barn leaned slightly east. 42 acres of pasture and woods stretched behind it. The deed was in my name alone. My parents had bought the farm after my father left the army, and my mother had made her intentions explicit in her will. Thomas never resented that. "The land is yours," he said the day we signed the probate papers. "My contribution is a riding mower that starts when emotionally ready." We renovated the farmhouse, repaired the barn, and expected to spend retirement traveling when we could afford it. That plan changed after Thomas received a call from a former loadmaster named Wes, who had been sleeping in his truck between treatment appointments and a warehouse job. Wes stayed in our spare room for 6 weeks. Then a social worker asked whether we could help an Air Force veteran leaving an inpatient program. We cleaned out the workshop beside the barn and added a shower. A church donated furniture. A local contractor donated labor. Within 2 years, we had converted part of the barn into 4 modest rooms for veterans moving between treatment, employment, and permanent housing. We called it Hale Landing. The name was Thomas's idea, but not because he wanted a monument. "An airplane does not land because it failed," he said. "It lands because people need a safe place to stop." Hale Landing became a nonprofit foundation. Thomas was its first board president. I managed resident standards, medical partnerships, property maintenance, volunteer training, and the detailed work donors rarely see in photographs. The foundation leased 6 acres from me for $1 a year. The lease allowed transitional housing and support services. It prohibited commercial development, transfer, or debt secured by the property without my written consent. Cynthia joined the board during the 3rd year. At first, she was excellent. She organized a Memorial Day breakfast that doubled our operating fund. She persuaded local businesses to sponsor rooms. She understood seating charts, donor recognition, and the emotional rhythm of a public event. Thomas was grateful. So was I. The trouble began when gratitude became permission. Cynthia redesigned our brochure. The cover showed Thomas in a flight suit beside a C-130. Inside, a 2-page feature called him the visionary founder of Hale Landing. My name appeared near the back under a photograph of volunteers painting a fence. Judith Hale, Colonel Hale's wife, continues to support his mission. I carried the brochure into Cynthia's office. "This was our mission," I said. "Of course it was. That is not what this says." She leaned back in her chair. "Donors need a clean story. Tom flew missions. He came home and gave veterans a place to land. It is memorable. I also flew missions. You know, I respect your nursing career. My nursing career included 24 years in uniform." Cynthia sighed. "Judy, not every sentence can contain both of you. I should have insisted that the brochure be discarded. Instead, I asked for a correction in the next printing. There was always a next printing, a next meeting, or a less inconvenient moment to defend myself. By the time I understood the pattern, Cynthia had learned that erasing me cost nothing. Thomas noticed more than I believed he did. One evening after a board meeting, he found me at the kitchen table crossing my name out of a draft press release because Cynthia had listed me as a volunteer liaison instead of co-founder. "Why are you fixing her document?" he asked. "Because the grant deadline is tomorrow." That was not my question. I kept editing. Correcting her in front of the board would have turned into a family argument. It already is a family argument. You are just having it alone. Thomas called Cynthia the next morning. I heard his side from the porch. "No, this is not about Judy being sensitive. It is about accuracy. Put her title back." The title returned, but the resentment stayed. Cynthia became more careful after that. She did not openly deny my role. She diluted it. She described me as the person who kept Tom organized. She praised my quiet support. At donor dinners, she asked Thomas to tell stories from the cockpit and asked me to explain the casserole rotation. When I spoke about medical partnerships, she would say, "That is Judy's nurse brain at work." The phrase sounded affectionate. It made 24 years of commissioned service sound like a personality quirk. Thomas and I argued about it twice. He wanted to remove Cynthia from the board. I resisted. "She is your sister," I said. She is disrespecting my wife. She is also raising half our operating budget. That does not purchase the right to rewrite you." I knew he was right. I also knew Hale Landing housed people who did not care whose name appeared on a brochure. Every conflict seemed less important than keeping the rooms open. I mistook protecting the mission for tolerating the behavior that would eventually endanger it. In the spring of 2023, Thomas began losing weight. He blamed the busy schedule and an ulcer. I blamed the coffee he drank instead of breakfast. By the time the scans were done, pancreatic cancer had already spread. The oncologist explained the treatment plan in a room with a landscape print, 2 straight-back chairs, and a box of tissues placed exactly where bad news expected to land. Thomas listened without interrupting. When the doctor left, he looked at me. "How bad?" he asked. "He told you." "He told the patient. I am asking the nurse." I held his hand. "Bad." He nodded once. "Then we used the time honestly. Illness divided our lives into public and private work. Cynthia managed the public side. She organized updates, meal deliveries, donor messages, and a campaign to add 4 accessible rooms to the barn. She called it Bring the Colonel Home. His photograph appeared on banners across the county. Contributions arrived from former crew members, local companies, and people Thomas had never met. I handled the private side. I measured medication into plastic cups. I learned which foods he could tolerate. I changed sheets at 3 in the morning and sat beside him when pain made speech impossible. I helped him shave after his hands began to tremble. I listened when he wanted to discuss funeral music and stopped him when exhaustion turned planning into punishment. Cynthia visited often, but she treated the house like a command post. She entered with folders, donor lists, and questions about who would lead the foundation after Thomas. One afternoon, I heard them arguing in the den. "Hale Landing cannot stay small forever," Cynthia said. "Small is not a failure," Thomas answered. "Neither is ambition. It is when ambition changes who the place serves." When I entered, Cynthia closed the folder on her lap. "What are we discussing?" I asked. "A future possibility," she said. Thomas looked at me. "A commercial development." Cynthia's face tightened. "A senior living partnership with veteran priority. On what land?" She did not answer immediately. That answer was enough. After Cynthia left, Thomas asked me to bring the red lease binder from his office. We reviewed every page. The foundation had use of 6 acres. The remaining 36 belonged to me without encumbrance. No board vote could change that. "Cynthia thinks a larger campus will attract national donors," he said. "Apartments, a conference center, a restaurant, maybe a memory care wing. That is not transitional housing," I told her. "Why did she approach you instead of me?" "Because she knew your answer." A cold pressure settled behind my ribs. "What did you tell her?" "That the land is yours. The foundation has a lease, not an inheritance. No transfer, no mortgage, no development without you." I reached for the binder, but Thomas kept his hand on it. "Do not let peace become the excuse they use to get past you," he said. "There is no they. There will be if money appears." He had grown thin enough that his wedding ring moved loosely on his finger. I wanted to tell him he was imagining danger because he could no longer control what came next. Instead, I asked what Cynthia had shown him. He opened the folder she had left behind. Inside were renderings from Sentinel Ridge Senior Living. 3 apartment buildings curved around a pond. A glass-fronted dining room stood where my mother's orchard had been. The words Hale Legacy Campus appeared in brass letters above the entrance. The proposal valued my land at $4 million and listed it as the foundation's equity contribution. No one had asked me. Thomas had an oral history appointment with the Greene County Military Archive a week later. Cynthia wanted to postpone it because he was weak. He refused. Megan Vale, Cynthia's daughter, worked for the County Historical Center and came to the farmhouse with a camera, microphones, and a young archivist named Owen Price. They recorded for nearly 3 hours over 2 days. Megan asked Thomas about pilot training, tactical airlift, Desert Storm, retirement, and Hale Landing. She also asked what military marriage had required from both of us. Thomas looked across the room at me. "Judith did not follow my career," he said. "We served in parallel. She was a flight nurse before most people in this county understood what that meant." Cynthia, who was sitting behind the camera, interrupted. "Let us keep this section focused on your service, Tom." Megan lowered her clipboard. "Mom, that was the question." Thomas continued. "Then keep the answer. 11 days later, he died just before dawn while rain moved against the bedroom windows, and I held his hand. Grief did not arrive as one clean blow. It arrived as forms, phone calls, medication bottles, a folded flag, and a coffee mug no one had permission to move. For months, I woke at 4:40 and reached toward his side of the bed before memory caught up with my hand. At the funeral, Cynthia gave the family eulogy. She spoke beautifully about her brother's courage, humor, service, and devotion to veterans. Near the end, she looked toward me. Judith stood faithfully behind Thomas through every chapter of his remarkable life. People turned with soft expressions. I lowered my eyes because correcting my sister-in-law beside my husband's casket would have looked petty, and Cynthia knew it. I had not stood behind Thomas's life. I had lived one of my own. That sentence became the foundation of everything she did next. During the first year after Thomas died, Cynthia's changes were so gradual that each one seemed too small to justify a fight. She changed the foundation letterhead from Hale Landing to Colonel Thomas Hale's Landing Foundation. She said donors responded to a recognizable hero. My title on the board minutes shifted from co-founder and property partner to founding family advisor. 3 months later, it became widow representative. She moved Thomas's uniform, medals, and photographs from our farmhouse to the display room at the center. I had agreed to lend selected items. Cynthia treated the loan as a transfer. When I asked for an inventory, she smiled. "Judy, you can walk across the field and see them whenever you want. That is not an inventory." Grief makes people hold tightly to objects. So does ownership. Her expression changed for half a second. Then the concern returned. At meetings, Cynthia began asking whether the financial reports were tiring me. If I questioned an expense, she said we had covered it the previous month. Sometimes she was right. I once arrived for a Thursday appointment on Friday. I left my reading glasses in the freezer beside a bag of peas. I forgot the name of a volunteer I had known for 2 years. Those mistakes frightened me more than I admitted. My mother had developed vascular dementia in her 70s. Cynthia knew that. She began keeping notes. I did not learn about the notes until later. At the time, I only noticed that board members spoke more slowly to me. A staff coordinator offered to manage my calendar. Cynthia still had a farmhouse key from Thomas's final illness. When I asked for it back, she said she had misplaced it. I should have changed the locks. Megan still visited. She was 32 then, thoughtful, observant, and less comfortable with her mother's version of family history than she had been as a child. She worked on digitizing oral histories and helped me sort Thomas's remaining papers. One afternoon, she found the drawing she had made at 9, the one with Thomas's enormous pilot wings and the red cross on my chest. "I did not know you had flight wings too," she said. "I still do. Mom always said you worked in hospitals on the bases where Uncle Tom was assigned." "I did that at times. I also flew aeromedical evacuation missions." Megan looked embarrassed. "Why did you never correct me?" I thought I had. That answer stayed with both of us. The Sentinel Ridge proposal returned the following March. Cynthia spread glossy renderings across my kitchen table as if the farmhouse were already a sales office. The plan had grown. It now included 180 senior apartments, a restaurant, a conference center, and a wellness pavilion. 24 units would be reserved for veterans at reduced rates. The rest would be rented at market prices. Cynthia spoke with the energy of someone offering me a gift. "This puts Hale Landing on the national map," she said. "It secures Tom's legacy permanently. It replaces Hale Landing. No, it expands it. 8 transitional rooms surrounded by luxury apartments are not the mission. They are decoration." She pressed her lips together. "You always reduce vision to logistics. Logistics is how vision survives contact with reality. The foundation would receive an ownership interest worth millions by contributing land it does not own." Cynthia tapped the rendering. "Thomas wanted this place to grow. He rejected this proposal. He was on morphine." The room became very quiet. Cynthia looked down first, but she did not apologize. Instead, she opened a second folder and slid a 2-page memorandum toward me. The document stated that Thomas and I had pledged the remaining 36 acres to the foundation upon his death. At the bottom was a copy of my signature. I knew the signature. It came from a volunteer background check authorization I had signed in 2018. The final loop of the H always dragged downward because the pen had caught on the paper. "This is not a document I signed," I said. "It was in the foundation files. It is not witnessed. It is not notarized. It refers to property Thomas never owned. Perhaps you do not remember." I looked at her. "Where did you get this?" "Judy, this is exactly why the board is concerned. The board has not spoken to me. They have seen enough." I folded the memorandum once and placed it in my pocket. Cynthia reached across the table. "That is foundation property. It contains my forged signature." Her hand stopped. For the first time, the patient mask slipped completely. "You are going to destroy what my brother built because you cannot bear for anything to continue without your permission. What your brother built sits on my land, under a lease I wrote with him." "There it is," she said. Your land, your rules, your service, your sacrifice, you turn everything back toward yourself. I stood. This meeting is over. Cynthia gathered the renderings slowly. Sentinel Ridge will present to the board on Veterans Day, she said. The board will also vote on accepting the Hale family land pledge. There is no pledge. Then you will have an opportunity to explain why Thomas believed there was. After she left, I locked the door and read the memorandum again. The language was polished enough to persuade someone who wanted it to be true. It referred to our shared desire and the Hale family legacy. It did not mention my mother, my deed, or the $1 lease. 2 days later, donors received an email from Cynthia. She wrote that I was struggling with grief-related confusion and had become hostile to the foundation. She said I had begun claiming parts of Thomas's service record as my own. She asked people not to confront me because public embarrassment could worsen my condition. The email reached me because a retired master sergeant named Calvin Brooks forwarded it with one sentence. "Colonel, is this what you authorized them to say?" I read the message 3 times. Then I drove across the field to Hale Landing. Cynthia was in a board meeting. Her assistant stopped me outside the conference room. "Miss Vale asked that you schedule visits in advance. I own the property." She said that response was part of the concern. Behind the glass door, I saw Cynthia speaking beneath a framed portrait of Thomas. Board members listened with folders open in front of them. My chair had been removed from the table. I did not force my way inside. I turned around and walked back to the farmhouse while rain began to fall. The cedar chest at the foot of my bed was open. My service dress jacket was gone. So were my ribbon rack, flight nurse badge, retirement certificate, and green flight logbook. On the dresser, Cynthia had left a typed receipt. Items removed for Foundation archival protection due to questions concerning provenance and donor ownership. I sat on the edge of the bed with the paper in my hand. The word that hurt most was not removed. It was provenance. Cynthia was no longer suggesting that I had become confused about dates. She was preparing to say that the evidence of my own life did not belong to me. I called the sheriff's non-emergency number. A deputy came to the house, read Cynthia's receipt, and asked whether she had ever been allowed to enter. "Not today." "Does the foundation have access to the property?" "To the leased acreage, not my home." Cynthia had an old key I believed was lost. "Is she family?" "My husband's sister." He made a report but warned me that ownership of archival items might become a civil dispute. His tone was respectful. Even so, I heard how the story sounded. A widow, a nonprofit, a dead colonel's medals, and 2 women giving opposite versions of who owned what. Cynthia understood the advantage of confusion. She did not need everyone to believe her immediately. She only needed them to hesitate before believing me. That evening, I sat alone in the kitchen with the rain tapping the windows. Thomas's chair was across from me. The forged memorandum lay beside Cynthia's receipt and the donor email. For the first time since his death, I felt anger stronger than grief. I also felt shame, not because Cynthia's accusations were true, but because part of her strategy had worked. I did not want to stand in front of people and recite my service like a defendant. I did not want strangers examining my memory, my medical records, or the mistakes I had made while mourning. I had spent a career believing the work should be enough. Now the work was locked in someone else's display room, waiting to be labeled as my husband's. At 9:12, someone knocked once and then used the brass knocker again. Denise Carver stood on the porch in a raincoat, holding a paper bag and an expression that had frightened junior officers for decades. Denise and I had met in Germany in 1987. She was an Air Force judge advocate then. By retirement, she was a colonel. Afterward, she practiced estate and nonprofit law in Dayton. She was also the person Thomas had named as alternate trustee in every document Cynthia had apparently forgotten to read. Calvin had called her, "I brought soup," she said. "It is not good soup," but arriving with legal pads seemed unfriendly. I let her in. She read every document without interrupting. Then she asked me to describe the missing items. When I finished, she placed the forged memorandum beneath the kitchen light. "Do you want to punish Cynthia?" she asked. "Or stop her?" "Both. Choose the one we can prove." I looked toward Thomas's empty chair. Denise tapped the donor email. "The insult is not the objective, it is the tool. What is the insult buying?" "The board's belief that I'm incompetent." "And what does that belief buy?" "My land." "Good. We start there." That sentence moved me out of pain and into mission mode. The next morning, Denise sent a preservation notice to the foundation, Cynthia and Sentinel Ridge. It required them to retain emails, drafts, board minutes, donor communications, electronic records, security footage, and every version of the land memorandum. She demanded the immediate return of my personal property and warned that any attempt to transfer or encumber the farm would be challenged. We did not begin with a public denial. We began with a chain of custody. The county recorder provided a certified copy of my deed. The title search showed no liens, pledges, options, or recorded interests beyond the 6-acre lease. The attorney who drafted the lease produced his original file, including Thomas's handwritten note in the margin. Judy keeps title. The mission gets use, not ownership. The volunteer form from 2018 contained the exact signature copied onto the alleged pledge. A document examiner later identified matching ink gaps, identical pixel distortion, and the same downward drag beneath the H. The signature had not merely been imitated, it had been scanned and placed. Denise located the notary, whose stamp appeared faintly on a draft in the foundation files. The woman signed an affidavit stating that she had never notarized a land pledge for me and had not been employed by the foundation on the date listed. That is the property side, Denise said. Now we address capacity before they make you defend it on their terms. I underwent a full neuropsychological evaluation with a specialist who had no connection to the foundation. It took most of a day. Memory tests, sequencing, language, problem solving, attention, executive function. I hated every minute of it. The doctor was direct. You show normal age-related variation and residual effects of bereavement, she said. You do not meet criteria for mild cognitive impairment or dementia. She paused. You also appear to have been frightened by ordinary mistakes because of your mother's history. That is accurate. Fear is not incapacity. Her report became one layer of evidence. It did not erase the misplaced glasses or missed appointment. It placed them where they belonged, inside a human life, not inside Cynthia's strategy. The military records required patience. My original retirement certificate had been taken, but official records did not live in a cedar chest. Denise requested certified copies of my retirement orders, officer performance history, aeronautical rating, awards, and citations. The Air Medal citation describes sustained meritorious achievement while participating in aerial flight during aeromedical evacuation operations in 1991. My service record showed 24 years in the Air Force Nurse Corps and retirement in the grade of lieutenant colonel. Calvin brought his own evidence. He had been a 26-year-old security forces staff sergeant when a vehicle accident overseas left him with internal injuries. I had been senior medical crew member on one leg of his evacuation to Germany. He did not claim I had single-handedly saved his life. That would have turned memory into theater. He remembered that I caught a change in his breathing, ordered a reassessment, and pushed for intervention before landing. You told me not to be brave for your convenience, he said at my kitchen table. I have repeated that line to every stubborn man in my family. He still had a letter I had written to his mother after he stabilized. He had also saved a photograph of our crew beside the aircraft. The image showed me in a flight suit, wearing captain's bars and a flight nurse badge, 13 years before Thomas became a colonel. Why did you keep all this? I asked. Because people forget the ordinary part of surviving, he said. Somebody did the work. The former commander of our aeromedical group, retired Major General Elias Grant, agreed to provide a statement. He was 81 and unimpressed by drama. Your sister-in-law says you borrowed Thomas's record? He asked over the phone. She says grief caused me to confuse his flying with mine. Thomas flew cargo aircraft. You moved patients. Did she confuse a stretcher with a C-130? She has not studied the distinction. Then perhaps the public lesson should be educational. General Grant had signed one of my evaluation reports. He also possessed official photographs from a 1,999 readiness exercise and a copy of the orders assigning me as chief nurse for an aeromedical evacuation squadron. The evidence was accumulating, but Denise kept the strongest pieces out of public view. Cynthia expects you to argue that you deserve respect, she said. We are going to show that she manufactured disrespect for financial purpose. That required proof of intent. It came from someone I had not expected. Lorna Pierce, the foundation's bookkeeper, called me from a grocery store parking lot. Her voice shook so badly that I initially thought she was ill. I saw the preservation letter, she said. There are emails you need. Do not take anything illegally. I do not have to. They are in the board archive. Cynthia told me to delete a folder yesterday, but our system preserves administrator copies. What is in it? Lorna was silent for several seconds. Sentinel Ridge's strategy notes and messages about you. Lorna met Denise the next day with the Foundation's independent board council present. She did not hand us a stolen thumb drive or a stack of secret printouts. She logged into the organization's retention system under supervision and identified records she was authorized to access as bookkeeper and board secretary. The messages showed that Cynthia had been negotiating with Sentinel Ridge for nearly 9 months. In one email, a vice president asked how the foundation intended to contribute land without my signature. Cynthia replied, Judith's attachment is emotional, not legal. Once the board formally recognizes the family pledge, she will not withstand public pressure. A month later, after the developer's attorney questioned the pledge document, Cynthia wrote, her recent confusion gives us another route. We are documenting incapacity and disputed claims concerning Tom's memorabilia. The board will understand that protecting the mission may require acting over her objections. The most damaging message had been sent 3 days before the donor email. Cynthia wrote, the uniform issue must be handled at the Veterans Day dinner. If Judy publicly insists the medals are hers, it will demonstrate exactly what we have been describing. Once donors see the confusion for themselves, opposition to the land vote should collapse. She had not taken my uniform because she doubted its provenance. She had taken it because she intended to use my ownership claim as evidence against me. The insult and the land deal were the same operation. Board counsel, a careful man named Arthur Bell, removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I advised Miss Vale that no land vote could occur without verified title authority, he said. She told the board you approved the pledge, Lorna answered. I approved placing a discussion item on the agenda. I did not approve a transfer. Will you cancel the vote? I asked. Arthur hesitated. The board chair believes canceling now could create panic among donors. He proposes hearing the presentation, then moving into executive session. Denise leaned forward. While Cynthia publicly diagnoses my client and displays property taken from her home, I was not informed that was part of the program. It is now, I said. Cynthia wrote it down. Arthur looked again at the email. I will require a response period and independent verification before any vote. Denise turned to me after he left. You do not have to attend, she said. We can seek emergency relief in court tomorrow. Hale Landing has residents who will hear that the foundation may be shut down because I am unstable and selfish. The court can protect the property. The court cannot correct what she says in that room unless someone carries the correction there. Denise studied me. Then we control the sequence. We do not let anger write your testimony. 2 days before the dinner, Megan came to the farmhouse after dark. She parked behind the barn rather than near the road and carried a padded archive case against her chest. I am not hiding from my mother, she said when I opened the door. I am avoiding a scene until I understand what I am doing. Inside the case were 2 solid-state drives and a signed chain of custody sheet from the county archive. One drive contained the full oral history recording of Thomas. The second contained the 4-minute version Cynthia had submitted for the dinner. Megan placed both on the table. Mom told me the long version was repetitive and medically distressing, she said. She asked me to certify the edited video as the complete final interview. Did you? No. She opened her laptop and displayed the edit timeline. Entire sections had been removed. Thomas describing my service. Thomas explaining the deed and lease. Thomas rejecting commercial development. Thomas saying Hale Landing should never become a monument sold to the highest bidder. Megan's eyes filled, but she did not cry. I believed her about you for years, she said. Not everything, but enough. You were given one story from childhood. I am an archivist. My job is to question a single story. That is your profession. She is your mother. She used my profession to make the lie look official. We watched one unedited section together. Thomas sat in his recliner, a blanket over his knees. His voice was weak, but his mind was clear. Owen, the interviewer, asked who owned the property and how the foundation should grow after Thomas's death. Judith owns Maple Run, Thomas said. Her mother left it to her. Hale Landing has a 6-acre lease because Judy believed the work needed protection from family emotion, including mine. She was right. He paused to catch his breath. Growth is not sacred. Mission is sacred. If a developer needs Judy erased to make the numbers work, the numbers are wrong. Megan closed the laptop. Mom saw this footage, she said. Yes. She knew exactly what he wanted. Yes. That truth hurt her in a way I could not soften without lying. We agreed that the archive would provide the unedited recording directly to board counsel. Megan would authenticate it publicly if necessary. I did not ask her to denounce her mother. I asked her to state what she knew and how she knew it. Before leaving, she touched the empty space in the cedar chest. Did Mom really take your uniform? She left a receipt. Megan shook her head. She told me she rescued Uncle Tom's medals because you were wearing them around the house. I have not worn that jacket since my retirement ceremony. What did his uniform look like? Silver eagles for Colonel, command pilot wings, aviation badges, and his own ribbon rack. And yours? Silver oak leaves for Lieutenant Colonel, flight nurse badge. Different ribbons, different name. Megan stared at me. She never looked closely. No, I said. She only looked confidently. On the morning of Veterans Day, Denise and I met at 7 in my kitchen. We arranged the evidence in a black leather folder with numbered tabs. certified deed, original lease, document examiner's report, notary affidavit, medical evaluation, retirement orders, air medal citation, aeronautical records, official photographs, Calvin's letter and crew picture, General Grant's statement, the preserved emails. Denise placed the forged pledge in a clear sleeve. Your first objective is not to prove you were a good officer, she said. Your record already does that. Your first objective is to expose why Cynthia needed people to doubt you. My second, protect the residents. My third, leave with your uniform. I looked out the window toward the barn. A maintenance volunteer was hanging small flags along the walkway. Hale Landing's 8 residents were helping set chairs for a dinner where donors would be told their home depended on taking mine. I had spent 18 months avoiding public conflict because I feared it would damage the foundation. That morning, I finally accepted that the conflict was already inside it. Silence was no longer protecting the mission, it was protecting Cynthia. The Veterans Day dinner was held in an aviation museum event hall near Dayton. Cynthia had chosen the room because one wall of glass overlooked restored aircraft suspended in the main gallery. She understood symbolism. She simply believed symbolism belonged to whoever arranged the chairs. I arrived with Denise, Calvin, General Grant, and Megan. Cynthia was standing near registration in a navy dress, greeting donors beneath a banner that read, "Preserving Colonel Hale's Legacy." When she saw us, her smile remained in place. "Judy, I did not realize you were bringing counsel. I did not realize you were bringing my uniform." Her eyes moved toward Denise. "The archival dispute will be handled appropriately." "It will," Denise said. Cynthia lowered her voice. "This evening is about Thomas. Please do not make a spectacle." I looked at the banner above her. "You already printed one." At the family table, my place card had been removed. A volunteer directed me to table 27 beside the kitchen doors. Calvin started to object, but I stopped him. "Let it remain exactly as she arranged it," I said. Megan's name was still at the family table beside her mother. She picked up the card, carried it to table 27, and placed it beside mine. Cynthia watched from across the room. That was the first thing she had not planned. Dinner began at 6:30. A high school color guard presented the flags. A minister offered a prayer. The mayor spoke about service and community. Cynthia moved through the program with practiced warmth, thanking sponsors and telling stories about Thomas. Each story was true. That was part of her skill. She did not invent her brother's courage. She used it as cover for what she invented about me. At 7:10, Arthur Bell approached our table. "Miss Vale added a segment," he whispered. "She says she must address concerns about the Foundation's historical collection before the board discussion." "Does the segment involve my jacket?" I asked. His face answered before his words did. "I have told her you will receive equal time." "Not equal time," Denise said. "A complete response, with exhibits." Arthur nodded. The board chair agreed. At 7:18, Cynthia carried my service dress jacket onto the stage. The room quieted. She held it by the shoulders. My name tag was missing. The silver oak leaves had been removed from the epaulets and placed in a small velvet box on the lectern. My flight nurse badge and ribbon rack remained pinned above the left pocket. Cynthia began with a sigh. "Families sometimes face private pain that becomes impossible to contain," she said. "My sister-in-law has endured profound grief since Thomas died. We love her and we have tried to protect her dignity." On the screen behind her appeared a photograph of Thomas in his flight suit. Recently, Judith has begun asserting that certain parts of Thomas's distinguished military record were actually hers. She removed items intended for the Hale Landing archive and claimed decorations belonging to my brother. "Tonight we are returning this jacket to the collection where it can be preserved accurately." A murmur moved across the room. Cynthia lifted the velvet box. "These are the silver insignia of my brother's rank as colonel." General Grant made a sound beside me that was almost a cough. Cynthia continued. "We do not blame Judith. Confusion is an illness, not a moral failure. But we cannot allow illness to alter history or block the future of the foundation Thomas created." There it was. Military accusation, medical diagnosis, and land deal joined in one sentence. She presented the Sentinel Ridge plan. Apartment buildings appeared on the screen. The pond gleamed. The restaurant windows reflected a sunset that had never happened over my mother's orchard. Cynthia described jobs, revenue, national visibility, and 24 reduced-rate units for veterans. She said the project would be funded through a generous pledge of Hale family land made before Thomas's death. When she finished, applause came from several sponsor tables. Other people remained still. Arthur walked to the microphone. "Before any board discussion, Mrs. Hale has requested an opportunity to respond to statements concerning her health, military service, property, and personal effects." Cynthia stepped toward him. Arthur, this is not appropriate. It became necessary when you made the statements publicly. I walked to the stage carrying the green flight logbook. Arthur had required Cynthia to return it that afternoon after seeing my name, service number, and decades of entries inside the cover. She had refused to release the jacket, insisting the coat itself belonged to Thomas's archive. I placed the logbook on the lectern and looked at the room. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Judith Ann Hale, United States Air Force. Retired, I said. I served 24 years in the Air Force Nurse Corps. I was rated as a flight nurse. I participated in aeromedical evacuation operations, and I retired in 2005. Those are not memories I borrowed from my husband. They are facts documented by the United States government. Cynthia stood to the side with her arms folded. I turned toward her. You said the insignia in that box represents Thomas's rank as colonel. Would you hold it up? She hesitated, then raised one piece between her fingers. What shape is it? I asked. A silver eagle. General Grant spoke from the floor. It is a silver oak leaf. The room went silent. I faced the audience. A colonel wears a silver eagle. A lieutenant colonel wears a silver oak leaf. Thomas retired as a colonel. I retired as a lieutenant colonel. Those insignia are mine. I pointed to the badge on the jacket. Thomas wore command pilot wings. That is a flight nurse badge. A medical caduceus rests on a shield between the wings. It was awarded to me after aeromedical training and qualification. Cynthia's face had lost color. The ribbon rack is also mine, I continued. It does not match Thomas's official portrait, his personnel record, or the uniform already displayed at Hale Landing. My name tag was attached when this jacket was taken from my bedroom. It is missing tonight. Someone near the reporter's table whispered, "Good Lord." I did not raise my voice. Cynthia spent 18 months telling you my memory was defective. She never learned the difference between her brother's uniform and mine. Calvin came to the microphone carrying the crew photograph. He identified himself, described the evacuation mission on which we had met, and held up the letter I had written to his mother. I do not know every award Colonel Hale earned, he said. I know who was responsible for my care on that aircraft. It was Lieutenant Colonel Judith Hale, then Captain Rowan. I have known her name for 35 years. General Grant followed. He confirmed my assignments, rating, rank, and award. He explained that Air Force flight nurses were commissioned officers and aircrew members trained to provide care under the physiological demands of flight. Then Denise placed certified copies of my records on the document camera. Retirement orders, aeronautical rating, air medal citation, official photograph. The images appeared 10 feet high behind us. Cynthia moved toward Arthur. This proves she served, she said. No one denied she was a nurse. It does not address her present condition or Thomas's wishes for the land. Denise looked at the clock. It is 8:02, she said. The memorial video addresses both. Megan stood from table 27. Cynthia stared at her daughter. What did you do? Megan's voice shook once, then steadied. I preserved the record. At 8:03, the ballroom lights dimmed. Thomas appeared on the screen in the recliner by our living room window. He looked older than I remembered him because memory had already begun protecting me from the final weeks. A gray blanket covered his knees. His wedding ring moved loosely when he lifted one hand. Owen Price's voice came from behind the camera. Colonel Hale, people often describe Hale Landing as the result of your military service. Is that how you see it? Thomas smiled faintly. No, it came from 2 careers, 1 marriage and Judy's land. I was the pilot people like to put on brochures. Judith was the flight nurse who knew what injured people needed after the applause stopped. No one in the ballroom moved. The interview continued. Thomas described my Gulf War evacuation missions, my later aeromedical work, and the years I managed the practical side of Hale Landing. Then Owen asked who owned Maple Run Farm. Judith owns it, Thomas said. Her mother left it to her. The foundation leases 6 acres. I did not own the other 36, and I could not pledge them. Cynthia stepped toward the sound table. This is not the approved edit. Arthur blocked the aisle. It is the authenticated master held by the county archive. On the screen, Thomas took a drink of water and continued. Cynthia has shown me a development proposal. She believes expansion protects my legacy. I told her a commercial campus is not our mission. Growth is useful only while it serves the people we promise to serve. If anyone has to erase Judith's ownership or service to make a deal possible, the deal is wrong. Megan closed her eyes. Thomas looked directly toward the camera. My sister loves me. She also has a habit of turning love into ownership. I hope she learns the difference before she harms the people she thinks she is protecting. The screen went black. For several seconds, the only sound was the ventilation system above us. Cynthia stood beside my uniform with one hand gripping the lectern. She had built her authority around speaking for Thomas. Now Thomas had spoken for himself, and his words had removed her from the center of the story. Denise did not allow the silence to become sympathy. She displayed the certified deed and original lease. The document examiner's report followed. 2 copies of my signature appeared side by side, identical down to the pixels. The purported land pledge was created using a signature lifted from a 2018 volunteer authorization, Denise said. The notary whose mark appears on a draft has sworn she did not witness it. Mrs. Hale never signed, witnessed, or authorized this pledge. Then Arthur read Cynthia's preserved emails aloud. Once donors see the confusion for themselves, opposition to the land vote should collapse. A board member near the front whispered, "She planned this." Another asked Cynthia whether the emails were genuine. Cynthia looked toward the Sentinel Ridge representatives. "Those messages are being taken out of context." "What context makes a forged signature acceptable?" Arthur asked. "I did not create that document." "Who did?" She opened her mouth and then looked at Lorna. The bookkeeper stood. "You sent me the signature file and told me the pledge had been approved by Colonel Hale before his death. I refused to place it in the executed contract folder. You placed it there yourself." The Sentinel Ridge vice president spoke briefly to his attorney, gathered his papers, and left the ballroom. The board chair canceled the land vote. On Arthur's advice, the board entered an emergency session in the room rather than behind closed doors. Cynthia was suspended as executive director and removed from all authority over records, property, communications, and finances pending an independent investigation. When the chair asked what I wanted, I looked toward the residents seated near the back. "I want my personal property returned," I said. "I want the public record corrected. I want the false statements about my health and service withdrawn in the same places they were published. I want no land negotiation conducted in my name or Thomas's. And I want Hale Landing's residents protected from the consequences of this family dispute." "What do you want done to Miss Vale?" "The investigation should follow the facts." Cynthia stared at me as though restraint were another form of humiliation. It was not. Restraint was the part of myself I refused to let her take. She lifted my jacket from the lectern and held it out. For a moment, neither of us released the fabric. "I was trying to save Tom's work," she whispered. "You were trying to own his meaning," I said. "They are not the same." I folded the jacket over my arm. Megan placed the silver oak leaves back in the velvet box and handed it to me. Outside, the November air was sharp. Calvin walked on one side of me and Denise on the other. Behind us, people stood beneath the ballroom lights, revising a story they had accepted less than an hour earlier. The public correction came within 2 days. Hale Landing posted my full biography, the board suspension order, and a statement acknowledging that the claims about my cognition, military record, and ownership of the uniform were false. The newspaper ran the crew photograph beside a still image of Cynthia holding my jacket. I disliked the word hero in the headline, but I understood why the correction needed to be as visible as the accusation. A judge later entered an order confirming the deed, the limited lease, and the invalidity of the alleged pledge. The foundation returned every item taken from my home. My missing name tag was found in Cynthia's desk drawer. The independent review lasted 4 months. It found no theft from resident accounts, which relieved me. It did find restricted donations used for development expenses, undisclosed payments to Cynthia's event company, altered board minutes, and repeated violations of conflict of interest rules. Cynthia resigned before the report became final and repaid the disallowed expenses. Sentinel Ridge withdrew permanently. Hale Landing remained 8 rooms, a converted barn, and a place where veterans could become steady without being turned into scenery for a luxury development. Megan visited every Sunday for a while. Some weeks we worked on the archive. Other weeks we drank coffee and did not mention her mother. She corrected the county catalog so my oral history appeared beside Thomas's rather than beneath it. She also recorded her own statement explaining how the edited memorial video had been created. "Accuracy is not betrayal," I told her. "It feels like it when the person you correct raised you." "I know." Cynthia came to the farmhouse in April. She parked at the gate and called before approaching the porch. "May I come to the door?" she asked. "Yes." She carried a flat archival box. Inside were my name tag, retirement certificate, original ribbon rack, and the photograph Megan had drawn from as a child. Cynthia placed the box on the porch table and remained standing. "I rehearsed an apology," she said. "It sounded like another presentation." "Then do not present." She looked older without the public smile. "I reduced your service because I could not tolerate sharing Tom's story with anyone, even his wife. After he died, I treated being his sister as a greater claim than your marriage, your work, or your ownership. I used your grief and your fear about dementia to make people doubt you. I took your uniform, I approved the false donor message? I knew Tom rejected the development, and I tried to make the land pledge look real because I believed the project would prove I understood his legacy better than you did. She swallowed. I humiliated you in public for financial leverage. There is no softer way to say it. It was the first apology she gave me that named the harm instead of mourning the consequences. Why now? I asked. Because Megan will not speak to me unless I stop calling myself misunderstood. That may be a reason to begin. It is not proof you have changed. I know. Do you? Her eyes moved toward the barn. I thought loving Tom gave me the right to decide what he meant. And what do you think now? That love without respect becomes possession. I believed she understood the sentence. I did not yet know whether she could live by it. I can work toward forgiving you, I said. You will not return to the foundation board. You will not manage my property, my records, or public statements about me. You will send written corrections to every donor who received your email. Any contact between us will happen by invitation, not entitlement. Cynthia nodded. Will we ever be family again? We are family now. Family is the fact that made this hurt possible. Trust is a different question. She accepted the boundary without arguing. That was her first useful act of repair. Over the next year, Cynthia sent the corrections. She repaid the foundation. She stopped using Thomas's name in her business materials. Once a month, she volunteered at a veterans food warehouse in Cincinnati, where no one introduced her as Colonel Hale's sister. I did not mistake those actions for restoration. I counted them as evidence. The following Veterans Day, Hale Landing held a small ceremony in the renovated barn. There were no television lights and no developer's logo on the coffee cups. Residents, volunteers, family members, and veterans filled mismatched chairs beneath warm strings of bulbs. 2 service dress jackets stood behind glass along the far wall. Thomas's display identified him as Colonel Thomas Edward Hale, tactical airlift pilot and co-founder. Mine identified me as Lieutenant Colonel Judith Hale, Air Force flight nurse and co-founder. His silver eagles rested beneath his name. My silver oak leaves rested beneath mine. His command pilot wings and my flight nurse badge were labeled accurately. Neither uniform stood higher than the other. General Grant spoke for 5 minutes and stopped on time, which Calvin called the greatest military miracle of the morning. Megan played a short section of Thomas's oral history, unedited. When his face appeared, I still felt the old ache, but it no longer came with the fear that someone else controlled his voice. Cynthia sat in the last row. She did not speak. When the ceremony ended, she helped stack chairs and left before anyone could thank her publicly. Megan joined me at the display case and straightened the label beneath my badge. Is that level? She asked. I looked at Thomas's uniform, then mine, reflected together in the glass. Yes, I said. Now it is accurate. The uniform had never created my courage, and public recognition did not restore the years Cynthia had reduced to a footnote. What restored me was simpler. My home remained mine. The veterans still had a place to land. Megan learned that correcting a family story was not the same as destroying a family. And I learned that peace purchased with my own disappearance was not peace at all. Respect should never have required a ballroom, certified records, or a dead man speaking from a screen. But once the truth stood in that room, no one could make me small again by calling my silence confusion.